Season 2 of Love, Transform, Evolve is brought to you by Dreams Financial. When I was looking for a new financial advisor, Alex and Steph were the obvious choice. They didn't just see me as a client, but rather as a partner in building and protecting my wealth. Their personalized approach and innovative solutions have made financial planning a breeze, not to mention the fact that they are in it with me, explaining everything as we go so that I always know where my money is going and why. And when it comes to the death of a loved one, Alex and Steph are experts at providing compassionate guidance, offering clarity and direction. For more information, visit their website at dreamsfinancial.ca. This is Love, Transform, Evolve. I'm your host, Cynthia Iorio. Welcome to episode 3, Mind Blown. Your brain rewires to believe that no one understands, no one can help me. It's a tremendous challenge to overcome.
There was an overwhelming sense of guilt every time that I left him alone.
Caregiving comes with its own unique set of challenges, including, but not limited to, mental health. When I was done caring for my mom, I was so relieved, which is bizarre to say, but I was relieved that I was outside of the intensity of it all and just took that next year to try and escape and inject as much life as I could into my world after caring for my dad, which was a much shorter, more intense experience. I just couldn't get it together. My brain could not catch up to what I had just been through. And it took a long time for it to kind of be in a space that could accept all that had just gone on. I've spoken to countless informal family caregivers for this podcast, and one of the most common sentiments that has been expressed has been loneliness. This feeling of being isolated by the experience of caregiving, and it's a tremendous challenge to overcome. I knew that I wanted to speak with someone who was an expert in the loneliness space. And I came across an article of someone named Cindy Jordan. And in this article, she talks about how the experience of losing her daughter ultimately led her down a path to explore what led to substance abuse. And at the root of it, she found loneliness. This root cause of loneliness led Cindy to do a lot of research on what actually happens to the human body and the human brain when this isolation, this loneliness takes hold. And she ultimately became the founder and CEO of Pyx Health, which combines easy-to-use technology and timely human connection and science-based programming to help improve the lives of those who are feeling extremely lonely. She and I had a conversation about what does chronic loneliness actually look like.
Your brain literally, and they've proven this now post-pandemic because they've given so much money to research, but your brain rewires to believe that no one understands, no one can help me. So that's why loneliness is so connected with mortality, because people stop taking their medicine, they stop going to the doctor. Like, it literally actually physically starts to deteriorate the body.
You're touching on so many things. So first of all, I do want to say I'm really sorry for the loss of your daughter. After I cared for my mom and lost her in 2016, I became a mom. And reprocessed the loss of my mother and the relationship with my mother newly through the eyes of a new mom. So I'm really sorry for your loss. I did read about Riley's mental health struggles in this beautiful op-ed, this tragically powerful is how I want to call it, op-ed that you wrote in Motherly in 2022, because it was so informative about all of the things that you just touched on, which was loneliness. And one of the things you said or you reference in that article is this concept of chronic loneliness, this difference of the idea of a loneliness being a feeling versus chronic loneliness. I'd love for you to talk about, that definition of what that is and how and develop a little bit further what you were saying before of how it actually impacts, the physical and the mental state.
Yeah. So the way I like to explain this is to like sort of correlate it to depression. So, we probably all know people who suffer from depression, like literally clinically suffer from depression. But then we also all know people who feel sad some days. That's the difference. And the way you diagnose depression is that you use an evidence-based screening that was developed by scientists. It's called the PHQ. And depending on how you score on it, you either are mildly depressed or not depressed or chronically depressed. And that's when often pharmaceutical intervention, et cetera, right? It's the same with loneliness. There's an evidence-based screening called the UCLA, and you test for that, and you can be not lonely, mildly lonely, or chronically lonely. And for folks who are chronically lonely, they are in trouble, which means they are unequivocally likely, well over 80% likely to have comorbidities around physical health. Because if you're in that chronic state, your brain has been telling you those messages over and over again for a long time. And I remember, the last 6 months of Riley's life were so hard because it was in 2021, but the pandemic was still around, and you could just see she had completely given up. Right. And so, because even though we were there, even though we were still trying, even though, we loved her so profoundly, it's, Cynthia, you're a mom, you understand, you can't even put a word to the way that you love your kids. Right. And, but for her, it was defeated. Like, no one is ever going to understand me. And so that's the connection. And there is, and I'm going to get it wrong, but the frontal lobe, so depression is serotonin levels. Loneliness is a rewiring of synapses in the frontal lobe, like literally where it starts with things like where you just sort of get yourself to the point where you're like, I don't want to go there, and I don't want to go see my family. It doesn't do me any good, to where it gets to the point where like you actually start to view people as a threat.
Wow.
Yeah. And so that's when you become like super recluse. And when I say recluse, I mean, you can still be out in the world, going to work, doing things. You could live in a house of 25 people and you could still be chronically lonely.
Yeah. That's one of the things I think that you said in the article, that chronic loneliness is the feeling like no one else can understand your burden or your hurt.
Correct.
And that isolation is then what makes you feel like you can't talk to people, you can't relate to people, you can't engage. I wonder, based on all of the research that you've done, what you think the relationship between chronic loneliness, burnout is, and the inability to ask for help.
It's interesting. I've always thought about chronic loneliness and the inability to ask for help because, again, just like the example I gave, there's a defeatist to it. It's like, why bother? Nobody understands. No one can help me anyway. My medicine can't help me. My mom can't help me. My friends can't help me. My community can't help me. But the burnout is interesting because, when I think about caregiving, and like I said, because I was the step parent, my family shifted on its axis when that happened, so if there was food in the refrigerator, I bought it. If we ate, I cooked it. If things got cleaned up around, I did it, and so I instantly overnight became the caregiver out of need for the family. And I think about that time in particular, and it's I guess the way I'm going to talk about burnout, I'm sorry, I'm going about this a long way, but for me, I felt like I couldn't, complain, and I'm using that in air quotes, or ask for help because Riley was my stepdaughter, not my daughter, right? Like, somebody else's two parents who birthed that baby were beside themselves. And so my pain was secondary. And that's when I think that why caregivers have such an accelerated rate of getting to chronic loneliness, because somebody else is suffering more than you. So you feel like, and that to me is the burnout. You feel like you can't really talk about it. You shouldn't. And what kind of person are you if you do? Like, who are you going to complain to about cooking a meal after your partner just lost their daughter?
Mental resilience that is required in the caregiving role is not something that is often discussed or focused on because we're so distracted by the things that need to be done. We're so distracted by the schedules, we're distracted by the systems, we're distracted by the people, but the mental toll, the mental resilience that is, that balancing act that we talk about in episode 2 needs to be highlighted, and it has the ability to completely ruin an otherwise opportunity to be there for somebody else. Anna Czarnecki is a caregiver to her husband who suffers from a mental illness, and she was a caregiver for her parents. We talked about what her experience was like and how did she have to fortify herself in how to be there for her husband.
Date number 2, he told me that he has bipolar disorder and he wanted me to know right off the bat. We had such a great first date. It was one of those, that they make movies about. It was met for drinks and it turned into, an 8-hour wonderful time walking around Montreal, getting to know each other. So we quickly knew there was a strong connection and he wanted me to know what I was getting into. So he told me about his illness and then told me to go home and do some research and make sure that I was okay with it before we proceeded. So I did. I went home, I did some reading, but I also had a feeling that this guy was special and I would rather walk into something with my eyes wide open than be surprised later on by someone else who wasn't maybe as forthcoming or didn't know that they had something that they had to deal with. And I knew that he was going to be someone who would do his ultimate best to try to manage the situation as best he could, which he has. He takes care of himself. He takes his medication. He hardly ever misses a dose. He gets good sleep. He really does make sure that the illness is managed to the best of his abilities.
How long have you been with him now?
18 years, 17, 18 years, so a long time.
And how has your experience been from or differed or compared to the expectation you set for yourself when you went home and did that research compared to 18 years later? Kind of what's that been like?
I would say for the first 16 or so years, it was exactly what I expected with some little surprises here and there. He had suffered some moderate depressions and just had a few days of severe depression. And it was something that I was expecting. But I would say in the last year and a half was something that I'd never experienced before, which is, Jason basically for the last year and a half on and off was depressed for the majority of it, and severely so, to the point where he even had suicidal ideation, which is something that we've never, ever had to deal with before. And that was probably the scariest thing I've lived through in my entire life. It's just every single night when he would go to bed, he would look at me with this look in his eyes that honestly made me wonder if I would see him the next morning. And there were times where I had no idea if I left him alone, what I would come home to. So that I never expected. And I don't think you could prepare yourself for it, even if you did all the research in the world.
How did you deal with those thoughts and that fear in the last year?
I would say I tried to reach out more in the last year and a half to my friends and my network than I had before. I still found it very difficult, though, to find people who would fully understand what I was going through. I think it's very difficult to have true empathy for someone unless you've walked a mile in their shoes. So I did find that those people who had dealt with this in their lives before were better equipped to be my support system than people who just basically asked me a lot of questions, which I know they needed to do so they could better understand what I was going through. But at times that would frankly exhaust me. I think that was one of the more difficult parts of dealing with this, is having to be the main point of contact and information for everybody in Jason's life as to how he was doing. And it was always the same thing. Someone would come up and say, "How's Jason today?" And I'd say, "It's not good." They're like, "Well, what's wrong? What's the matter?" And I'd have to explain. And it was over and over and over again. And there would just be question after question. Well, is he going to the doctor? Is he taking medication? Is he doing this? Is he doing that? Have you thought of this? Have you thought of that? And it was like on a loop where I would just be answering the same questions over and over again, to the point where I was exhausted, and people weren't necessarily asking me how I was. And the ones who got it did, and it helped, but it was still very difficult to kind of have to be, his voice, and then also be able to have my own.
And what was the best form of support that you received during that time?
I think it was friends who would reach out to me consistently, not the ones who would just once in a blue moon, but the ones who would remind me that I needed to take care of me, and would make sure that I got out of the house. They would find excuses or ways to just get me out of the situation, and they offered to have somebody come and stay with Jason if I couldn't get out of the house because I felt guilty. And I think that was the other thing. There was an overwhelming sense of guilt every time that I left him alone. But I also knew that if I didn't take care of myself, then I would be in absolutely no shape to be a caregiver. In fact, I kept using the analogy of the oxygen mask on the airplane. I needed to give myself some oxygen first before I could be there to help him breathe.
When I think about the pain and the pressure in my brain that happened as a result of the mental load, and I really look at myself and who I am as a human being and my patterns, I can tell you that I actually turn on myself when I feel overwhelmed. This inner voice, known as the inner critic, known as the ego, whatever you want to call it, when I'm thrust into a situation that is unfamiliar, I get extremely insecure. But what I start to do is I start to beat myself up. And I start to point out all of the things that are, in my mind, weaknesses. And then I feel extreme guilt. And this is not just in caregiving, but this is just in life. And these are patterns that if I don't pick them up quickly enough, if I don't identify them as soon as they start to happen and give myself the opportunity to change that narrative, they could send me down a dark path. And so when I think about loneliness and I think about the stories that we tell ourselves in our heads, having the ability to prevent us from doing the important work, not only of caring for others, but caring for ourselves, all I want to do is reach out and give us all a really big hug and help people get through that. I wonder for you, what does the mental burden feel like in your caregiving journey? If you like what you heard today, be sure to rate, follow, or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. New episodes from Season 2 of Love, Transform, Evolve drop every Wednesday morning. I'm Cynthia Iorio. Until next time.